Sometimes the biggest gambles in life aren't made at card tables, they're made with your last dollars and a dream nobody else believes in. When Elias Cole bets his final 1,000 on a rotting steamboat in 1896, the whole town calls him a fool. The River Queen hasn't moved in 20 years. She's half buried in mud, her decks warped, her hull cracked. Most folks see firewood, Elias sees hope. Month after month, he works alone, replacing planks, scrubbing rust, pouring everything he has into a vessel everyone abandoned. Then, the moment he finishes, a stranger knocks at his door with news that turns his world upside down. What secret did that old riverboat carry for 2 decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Elias Cole first saw the River Queen up close, she sat listing 15 degrees to starboard in the shallows of Broken Bow Creek, half a mile downstream from where the creek met the Missouri River. That was in March of 1896, 3 weeks after his 48th birthday, and 2 days after he'd buried what remained of his cattle herd following the worst winter Montana had seen in living memory. He'd come down from the high country with a horse, a bedroll, and $973, everything he had left in the world, after selling off the last of his stock to a buyer from Billings. The money sat heavy in a leather pouch against his chest, and every step his mare took toward the river town of Cottonwood, Bend felt like walking toward either salvation or the edge of a cliff. He wasn't sure which. Elias had been a cowboy his whole life, just like his father before him, but his father had also been something else, a river pilot in his younger days, before the railroads came and the steamboat trade started dying. Thomas Cole had kept a logbook from those years, a thick, leather-bound journal with water-stained pages that smelled of tobacco and river mud. Elias carried it in his saddlebag now, though he'd read every entry 100 times over. His father's careful handwriting documented every bend, every sandbar, every landmark along 1,000 miles of river. But more than that, it documented a way of life that was disappearing, just like the open range was disappearing, just like everything Elias had known was slipping away like water through his fingers. The River Queen appeared in that logbook exactly 3 times. Once in 1872, when she was new and magnificent, her twin smokestacks gleaming, her paddle wheel churning white water as she carried passengers and freight between Street, Louis, and Fort Benton. His father had written, "Finest vessel on the river, built by Vanderbilt money, commissioned by the old man himself. She runs smooth as silk and fast as anything I've seen." The second entry came in 1878, noting that the River Queen had been refitted with reinforced holds, apparently for carrying payroll and valuables. The third and final entry was from 1881. Just a brief note. River Queen laid up at Cottonwood Bend, heard she won't run again, shame to see her go. That was 15 years ago. Now, in 1896, the boat hadn't moved in 2 decades, and she looked like the ghost of everything his father had loved about the river. Elias dismounted on the muddy bank and stood there a long time, just looking at her. The River Queen was a side-wheeler, not a stern-wheeler, which meant she had paddle boxes on both sides rather than a single wheel at the back. She measured maybe 120 feet from bow to stern, with 2 decks visible above the waterline, though God only knew what the hull looked like below. The upper deck, what would have been the passenger deck, sagged in the middle. The pilot house at the front leaned at an angle that would have been comical if it weren't so sad. Both smokestacks had fallen years ago, leaving jagged metal stumps. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood that had gone grey and split with age. But it was the nameplate that caught his attention and held it. Bolted to the bow, just above the waterline, was a brass plate maybe 2 feet long. Even through the tarnish and mud, he could make out the letters River Queen. Someone had cared enough, once upon a time, to give this vessel a proper name in proper brass. That meant something to Elias. It meant she'd been loved. "You thinking of buying her?" Elias turned to find a man in a shopkeeper's apron standing on the bank behind him, arms crossed, expression somewhere between amused and pitying. "Might be," Elias said. The shopkeeper, whose name turned out to be Henry Watts, laughed outright at that. "Friend, that boat's been sitting there since before my oldest was born, and he's 19 now. She's not a boat anymore. She's a pile of rotting timber that happens to float. Who owns her? Town does, technically. Took her for unpaid mooring fees back in 83 or 84, somewhere in there. Been trying to sell her for scrap ever since, but nobody wants to pay even scrap prices for the amount of work it'd take to break her down and haul the pieces away." Henry squinted at Elias. "You're not from around here." "Montana," Elias said. "Had a ranch up north of Helena until this winter." Something shifted in Henry's expression, a flicker of understanding and sympathy. Everyone had heard about the winter of 95 to 96, cattle frozen standing up, entire herds lost. Men who'd spent their whole lives building something wiped out in 3 months of killing cold. "I'm sorry," Henry said quietly. "That was a rough one." "It was." Elias looked back at the River Queen. "What would the town take for her?" "You serious?" "I'm asking." Henry studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "I sit on the town council. I'd have to talk to the others, but honestly I think they'd take just about any reasonable offer. Like I said, she's costing us mooring space, and she's an eyesore. Most folks would be happy to see her gone, one way or another. Would they take $1,000? Henry's eyebrows went up. "You've got $1,000 to spend on that wreck?" "I've got $973, Elias said, "but I'd round it up to 1,000 if that's what it takes." "Lord Almighty," Henry shook his head slowly. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, friend, but that's a lot of money to gamble on something that might not even be salvageable. Have you been down in the hull? Checked the framing? The decking? Any of it?" "Not yet." "Well, you should. Before you make any kind of offer, you should get yourself a good look at what you're buying. I can arrange it if you want. Have someone row you out there tomorrow morning." "I'd appreciate that." Henry stuck out his hand. "Henry Watts. I run the general store up on Main Street. You need a place to stay. The boarding house is 2 blocks north, run by Mrs. Palmer. She's fair with her prices." Elias shook his hand. "Elias Cole. And I'm obliged." The next morning, Henry Watts rowed him out to the River Queen in a flat-bottomed skiff, along with a man named Dutch Kerner, who claimed to know something about boat construction. Dutch was in his 60s, built like a barrel, with hands scarred from a lifetime of working with wood and iron. They tied up to the River Queen's starboard paddle box and climbed aboard. The main deck was a mess of broken crates, rotted rope, and bird nests. Mud had worked its way up through the seams in the deck planking, and mushrooms grew in the shadows where the upper deck overhang blocked the sun. "She's worse than I thought," Dutch muttered, testing a deckboard with his boot. The wood flexed ominously. "These planks are shot. You'd have to replace most of the decking." They made their way aft to a hatch that led below. The smell that rose from the darkness was thick with mold and stagnant water. Dutch climbed down first, and Elias followed, his boots splashing into 6 inches of murky water that had collected in the bilge. Dutch had brought a lantern, and by its light they could see the ribs of the hull, the heavy oak framing that formed the skeleton of the boat. Elias ran his hand along one of the frames. The wood was solid, barely any rot. Same with the next one. And the next. "Well, I'll be," Dutch said, sounding surprised. "The framing's still good. I mean, you've got some rot here and there, but the main structure's sound. This old girl was built to last." They spent an hour down there, checking seams, testing timbers, examining the paddle wheel mechanism through an access panel. When they finally climbed back up into daylight, Dutch was shaking his head in what looked like reluctant admiration. "She's a mess," he said. "No question about that, but she's a fixable mess. You'd need to replace the decking, patch the hull in a dozen places, rebuild the upper deck entirely, get new smokestacks fabricated, overhaul the paddle wheel, and that's just to make her float proper and look halfway decent. To make her run, you'd need a boiler and an engine, and Lord knows what that would cost. But it could be done? Elias asked. It could be done, Dutch admitted, though I don't know why anyone would want to. Steamboats are finished, son. Even if you got her running, where would you take her? The railroads own the freight business now. Passengers don't want to spend days on a boat when they can take a train and get there in hours. I don't need her to make money, Elias said quietly. I just need her to float. Dutch and Henry exchanged a look. Henry cleared his throat. Elias, I've got to ask why. You could take that $1,000 and start over somewhere. Buy some land, maybe run some cattle on a smaller scale. Why pour it into this? Elias looked at the River Queen, at her sagging decks and broken pride. He thought about his father's logbook, about the man who'd written those entries with such obvious love for the river and everything on it. He thought about the ranch he'd lost, about the feeling of helplessness as he'd watched everything he'd built slowly die in the cold. He thought about how it felt to have something slip away and know you couldn't stop it, couldn't save it, couldn't do a damned thing but watch it go. Because someone should, he said finally. Someone should care enough to try. Henry was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll talk to the council tomorrow. I think we can work something out. 3 days later, Elias Cole owned the River Queen. The town council accepted $850, letting him keep a little over $100 for supplies and materials. He moved his bedroll into what had once been the captain's quarters on the upper deck, a small room with walls that let in wind and rain, but at least had a roof that mostly held. He stabled his horse at the livery in town and paid for a month's feed in advance. Then he got to work. The first thing he did was bail out the bilge water and seal the worst of the hull leaks with oakum and tar. He worked from dawn until it was too dark to see, and when the townspeople asked what he was doing, he told them the truth, fixing her up. Most of them thought he was crazy. Some said so to his face, others just shook their heads and walked away, the way you might walk away from a man talking to himself on a street corner. But there were a few who helped. Dutch Kerner came by most afternoons and showed him how to properly fit deck planks, how to check the framing for rot, how to seal seams so they'd actually hold. Henry Watts extended him credit at the general store for nails, oakum, tar, and lumber. A young man named Ben Corrigan, who worked at the sawmill, made sure Elias got decent prices on timber and sometimes delivered it himself, rowing it out to the boat on a makeshift raft. Slowly, board by board, the River Queen began to change. Elias replaced the rotted decking. He rebuilt the railings around the upper deck. He cleaned out decades of accumulated mud and bird droppings, and God knew what else. Every night, his muscles ached in ways they hadn't since his first years working cattle as a young man. Every morning, he woke up and looked at what he'd accomplished, and it never seemed like enough. But he kept going. The townspeople got used to seeing him out there, a lone figure moving around on the old boat's deck, hammering, sawing, hauling timber and buckets of tar. Some of them started calling him River Rat Cole, and the name stuck. He didn't mind. He'd been called worse. At night, alone in the captain's quarters with a lantern burning low, he'd take out his father's logbook and read the entries about the River Queen, about the days when she'd been new and proud and fast. He'd run his fingers over the water-stained pages and imagine what it must have been like to stand in the pilot house and feel her respond to the wheel, to watch the river slip past while the paddle wheel churned and the smokestacks breathed. He couldn't bring those days back. He knew that. The river trade was dead and buried, killed by the railroads and by time itself. But he could bring the River Queen back, could restore at least some of her dignity, could make her something more than a rotting wreck slowly sinking into the mud. That had to count for something. It had to. 6 months later, on a cool morning in late September, Elias stood on the forward deck of the River Queen and looked at what he'd accomplished. The decking was new, solid planking that didn't flex or creak when you walked on it. The railings were straight and sturdy. The upper deck had been rebuilt, its supports reinforced, its walls made weather-tight. He'd even managed to salvage enough brass fittings from the old pilot house to give her back some of her former shine. She'd never run again. He didn't have the money for a boiler or engine, and he'd never intended to make her run anyway, but she floated clean and proud, and when the morning sun hit her the right way, you could almost see what she'd been in her glory days. His money was gone, every penny spent on lumber and nails and tar and brass polish. His hands were scarred from splinters and cuts. His back ached every morning when he rolled out of his blankets. But when he looked at the River Queen, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the winter killed his herd. Pride. Simple, honest pride in work well done. He was polishing the ship's wheel when he heard footsteps on the gangplank. The wheel was mounted in what had been the pilot house, though Elias had opened up the forward wall to turn it into more of a covered deck than an enclosed room. The wheel itself was a massive thing, 5 feet across, made of iron with wooden handles spaced around its circumference. It weighed close to 200 pounds and was mounted on a heavy iron column that ran down through the deck to the rudder mechanism below. Elias had spent the better part of a week just cleaning the rust off it, and now he was working on polishing the brass fittings that held the handles in place. He looked up to see a woman climbing aboard. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in travelling clothes that were well made but dusty from the road. She carried a leather satchel and moved with the careful precision of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable on a boat. "Mr. Cole," she called out. Elias set down his polishing cloth and stepped out from under the pilot house overhang. "That's me. Can I help you?" She walked toward him across the forward deck, and as she got closer, Elias could see that her face was drawn with exhaustion and something else, tension maybe, or worry, carefully held in check. "My name is Clara Vanderbilt," she said. "I've been looking for this boat for 3 years. The name Vanderbilt hit Elias like a physical blow. He thought about his father's logbook, about the entry that had said the River Queen was built by Vanderbilt money. "You're related to the man who built her?" "He was my father." Clara stopped a few feet away from him, looking past him at the wheel, at the pilot house, at the decks Elias had spent half a year rebuilding. "William Vanderbilt. He died in 1893. "I'm sorry for your loss," Elias said automatically, then felt foolish saying it. The man had been dead for 3 years, but Clara nodded, as if the condolence still meant something. "Thank you." She turned her attention back to Elias. "I heard in town that you bought the River Queen and have been restoring her. May I ask why?" It was a fair question, and one Elias had been asked a dozen times by townspeople who thought he was wasting his money. But coming from her, it felt different, weightier somehow. "My father was a river pilot," he said. "He logged this boat a few times back when she was new. I suppose I wanted to save something he'd cared about." Clara's expression softened slightly. "That's a good reason. Better than most." She looked around again, taking in the restored deck, the rebuilt railings, the polished brass. "You've done beautiful work." "She's not running," Elias said. "I didn't have money for an engine or boiler, but she's sound now. She'll float for another 50 years if someone takes care of her." "That's more than anyone else would have done." Clara set down her satchel and moved closer to the wheel, running her hand along one of the wooden handles. "Do you know why my father built this boat, Mr. Cole? The way I heard it, he built her to run freight and passengers." "That's what he told everyone," Clara said. "But it wasn't the truth, or at least it wasn't the whole truth." She looked at him directly, and Elias could see pain in her eyes, old and deep. "My father built the River Queen to move money." Elias frowned. "Come again?" "In 1872, when this boat was commissioned, my father was involved in certain financial dealings that required discretion. Moving large amounts of cash or gold by train was dangerous. Bandits, corrupt officials, too many people involved. But a riverboat? A riverboat could go places quietly, could carry valuables without drawing attention, especially if those valuables were hidden properly. "What kind of valuables are we talking about?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the wheel and ran her fingers along the iron column that supported it. The financial panic of 1893 ruined my father, she said quietly. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, he lost almost everything. But before he died, he told me about the River Queen. He told me that if I could find her, if she was still intact, there might be something aboard that could help me. Did he say what? He said it was in the wheel. Clara looked at Elias. May I examine it? Elias stepped aside. It's your father's boat. Or was. I suppose you've got more right to it than I do. You're the one who saved her, Clara said. That gives you rights of your own. But she was already moving toward the wheel, her hands running over the iron column, the wooden handles, the brass fittings Elias had spent hours polishing. She worked in silence for a few minutes while Elias watched, unsure what to think or what to expect. Then she made a small sound of satisfaction and pressed something on the underside of the column, hidden beneath one of the brass mounting plates. There was a soft click, and one of the wheel's spokes, the thick iron spokes that connected the outer rim to the central hub, shifted slightly. Clara pulled on the spoke, and it came free, revealing that it was hollow. "Dear God," Elias breathed. Clara reached into the hollow spoke and pulled out a leather pouch, small and heavy. She opened it carefully, and even in the morning light, Elias could see the glint of uncut stones, diamonds, by the look of them, rough and irregular, but unmistakably valuable. "There are 8 spokes," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "If they're all like this one, then my father was telling the truth. He did leave something behind." Elias felt like the deck had tilted beneath him, even though the River Queen sat perfectly level in the calm water of the creek. "How much are we talking about?" "I don't know exactly. Uncut diamonds are difficult to value without proper assessment. But my father said there were enough to secure my future, and the future of anyone who helped me find them." She looked at Elias. "You brought me here, Mr. Cole, even if you didn't know it. You kept this boat from being torn apart for scrap. Without your work, I never would have found this." "I didn't know," Elias said, "about any of it. I just wanted to fix her up." "I believe you." Clara carefully replaced the leather pouch in the spoke and slid the spoke back into place. The click when it locked was barely audible. "But now, you do know, and that puts us both in an interesting position." Elias's mind was racing. Diamonds hidden in a steamboat wheel, a fortune that had been sitting here for 20 years while the boat rotted and the river moved past. All the months he'd spent working on this vessel, sleeping in the captain's quarters, eating beans and hardtack to save money for lumber, and the whole time there'd been a treasure worth more than he could imagine, hidden just a few feet from where he slept. "What do you plan to do?" he asked. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and Elias got the sense she was measuring him somehow, weighing what she saw against some internal standard. Finally she said, "I need to think, and I imagine you do too. This isn't a conversation to rush through." "No," Elias agreed. "I suppose it's not. May I come back tomorrow? With a proposal that might benefit us both." Elias nodded slowly. "You can come back. But Miss Vanderbilt, Clara, I want to be clear about something. I bought this boat fair and square. Whatever's in that wheel, I've got some claim to it just by virtue of owning the vessel." "I know," Clara said, "and I wouldn't argue otherwise. That's why I want to make you a proposal, not a demand." She picked up her satchel. "Tomorrow morning, will you be here?" "I'll be here." Clara nodded and walked back toward the gangplank. At the edge of the deck, she paused and looked back. "Thank you for restoring her, Mr. Cole. My father would have appreciated what you've done." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading as she crossed the gangplank and disappeared up the muddy bank toward town. Elias stood alone on the deck of the River Queen, staring at the ship's wheel. The brass fittings gleamed in the morning sun, polished to a mirror shine by hours of his labor. The iron spokes were solid and strong, hiding secrets he'd never imagined. Everything had just changed, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in his blankets in the captain's quarters, listening to the water lap against the River Queen's hull, and tried to make sense of what had happened. A fortune in diamonds, hidden for 20 years, and now a woman he'd just met was coming back with a proposal that would somehow divide them between her and him. He got up and lit the lantern, then pulled his father's tintype photograph from the small wooden box where he kept his few precious belongings. The image was faded, the metal surface scratched and worn, but he could still make out his father's face, Thomas Cole, at maybe 35 years old, standing on the deck of a steamboat with the river visible behind him. He wore a pilot's cap and held himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his trade and was proud of it. Elias had been 12 when that photograph was taken. He remembered the day, remembered watching the photographer set up his equipment on the boat's deck while his father stood perfectly still, trying not to blink. Later, his father had given him the tintype and said, "Keep this. When I'm gone, you'll want something to remember me by." "What would you do?" Elias asked the image now. "If you found out the boat you'd been working on had a treasure hidden in it, would you take it? Would you feel like you'd earned it? Or would you feel like a thief?" The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but Elias thought he knew what his father would say. Thomas Cole had been an honest man, the kind who paid his debts and kept his word even when it cost him. He'd also been a practical man who understood that sometimes life handed you opportunities you'd be a fool to pass up. The question was, which kind of opportunity was this? Elias had bought the River Queen legitimately. He'd paid the town council $850 for a wreck nobody else wanted. He'd spent 6 months of back-breaking labor bringing her back from the edge of destruction. Every plank on her deck, every sealed seam in her hull, every polished fitting that was his work, his sweat, his effort. But the diamonds weren't his. They'd been hidden by William Vanderbilt, placed there before Elias was even born. The fact that he'd unknowingly bought a boat with a fortune concealed inside didn't make that fortune his any more than finding money in a used coat made it yours. Except the law might see it differently. He owned the boat. Everything aboard her, hidden or not, could be argued to be his property by right of purchase. And then there was Clara Vanderbilt herself. She'd travelled for 3 years looking for this boat, following whatever trail her dying father had left her. She'd shown up exhausted and worried, carrying the weight of her father's financial ruin and probably dealing with her own struggles. Those diamonds represented her inheritance, the thing her father had wanted her to have. But she'd said she had a proposal, not a claim. That meant she was willing to negotiate, willing to acknowledge that Elias had rights here too. He put the tintype back in its box and pulled on his boots. Sleep wasn't going to come tonight, so he might as well do something useful. He grabbed the lantern and headed out onto the deck. The night was cool. The sky clear enough to see stars scattered across the darkness like spilled salt. Elias walked to the pilot house and stood looking at the wheel. In the lantern light, the brass fittings gleamed and the iron spokes threw long shadows across the deck. 8 spokes. Clara had checked one and found diamonds. If they were all filled, if every hollow spoke contained a pouch like the one she'd pulled out, then the total value must be staggering. Enough to change a life completely. Enough to start over, buy land, build something new. Enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. The next morning, Dutch Kerner rowed out to the River Queen just after dawn. He did that sometimes, bringing coffee and biscuits that his wife had made, sitting with Elias on the deck while they watched the sun come up over the river. "You look like hell," Dutch said, handing him a tin cup of coffee. "Didn't sleep much." "Woman trouble?" Elias almost laughed. "Something like that." Dutch settled himself on a crate and bit into a biscuit. "You want to talk about it?" "Not really." Elias sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter, and exactly what he needed. "Dutch, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If you found out something you owned was worth a lot more than you paid for it, not because of anything you did, but just because there was something valuable you didn't know about when you bought it, would you feel like you'd come by it honestly?" Dutch chewed thoughtfully for a moment. "That's a loaded question." "I know. If I bought a piece of property and later found gold on it, I'd figure that gold was mine, came with the property. whether I knew about it or not. Dutch paused. But if I bought an old trunk at an estate sale and found a bag of gold coins hidden in a false bottom, I'd feel obligated to give it back to the family, because that gold wasn't part of the trunk. It was something hidden there, something someone meant to come back for. What's the difference? Intent, Dutch said. Gold in the ground is part of the land. Gold in a trunk is something separate, something someone put there for safekeeping. Context matters. Elias nodded slowly. It made sense, the way Dutch put it. The diamonds in the wheel weren't part of the River Queen. They were something hidden aboard her, concealed with the expectation that someone specific would retrieve them later. You in some kind of trouble? Dutch asked. I don't think so, but I might have some decisions to make soon. Well, if you need advice or help or just someone to talk things through with, you know where to find me. Dutch finished his coffee and stood up. I've got to get to the lumber yard. But Elias, whatever this is about, don't let it steal your pride in what you've done here. You saved this boat. That's worth something all by itself. After Dutch left, Elias sat alone with his thoughts. The old man was right. The River Queen was a good thing he'd done, regardless of what was hidden in her wheel. He'd taken something broken and made it whole. He'd honored his father's memory and saved a piece of river history from being lost forever. That mattered. It had to matter. But the diamonds mattered too. And Clara Vanderbilt mattered, and the decision he was about to face, whatever proposal she brought with her today, would matter more than anything he'd decided in a long time. He looked at the ship's wheel. At the spoke Clara had opened and then carefully closed again. The mechanism was clever, he had to admit. You'd never know it was there unless someone showed you. And if the River Queen had been scrapped, if she'd been torn apart for lumber and scrap metal the way the town council had originally intended, those diamonds would have been discovered by whoever was doing the dismantling. Some random workman would have found a fortune and walked away with it, and Clara Vanderbilt never would have known. Elias had saved the River Queen. In doing so, he'd saved Clara's inheritance too, even though he hadn't known it at the time. Maybe that gave him the right to a share. Maybe it meant he'd earned something beyond just the satisfaction of a job well done. Or maybe it just made the situation more complicated than it needed to be. He'd find out soon enough. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning mist that hung over the creek. Clara would be here before long, with her proposal and her expectation of an answer. Elias just hoped he'd know the right thing to say when the time came. Clara returned at mid-morning, carrying the same leather satchel and looking somewhat more rested than she had the day before. She climbed aboard the River Queen without waiting for an invitation and found Elias on the aft deck, checking the paddle wheel housing for any signs of new wear. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." Elias straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You said you had a proposal." "I do." Clara set down her satchel and pulled out a rolled document tied with a faded blue ribbon. "But first, I want to show you something." She untied the ribbon and unrolled the document carefully. It was old, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the writing was still clear. At the top, in ornate script, were the words, "Bill of Sale and Registry." "This is the original deed of commission for the River Queen," Clara said. "My father kept it all these years. It shows that he paid for her construction in 1872 and held title to her until he sold her to the Missouri River Transport Company in 1880. Elias looked at the document but didn't touch it. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that this boat meant something to my father. She wasn't just a business investment. He designed her himself, worked with the shipwrights to make sure every detail was exactly what he wanted. The River Queen was his pride, the thing he pointed to when people asked what he'd accomplished in his life." Clara's voice softened. "When he lost everything in the panic, when the banks failed and his businesses collapsed, he told me that letting the River Queen go was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. It was like losing a part of himself." "I'm sorry," Elias said quietly, "but I'm not sure what this has to do with your proposal." Clara rolled the document back up and set it aside. I don't want the diamonds, Mr. Cole. Elias blinked. Come again? I don't want the diamonds, she repeated. Or rather, I don't need them for myself. What I need is this boat. I don't understand. Clara took a breath, and Elias could see her choosing her words carefully. Before my father died, he asked me to promise him something. He asked me to do something good with whatever he left behind, something that would help people. He'd spent his whole life making money, building businesses, accumulating wealth, and in the end, all of it disappeared like smoke. He said he didn't want to be remembered as just another rich man who died broke. He wanted his legacy to be something that mattered. What did you promise him? I promised I'd use whatever inheritance I could find to establish a medical mission, a place where people who couldn't afford doctors could get treatment, where the poor and desperate wouldn't be turned away. Clara looked at the River Queen, at her rebuilt decks and sturdy hull. I've been planning to rent a building in St. Louis or Kansas City, somewhere central where I could do the most good. But when my father told me about the diamonds, when he said they were hidden in the River Queen, I started thinking, what if I didn't need a building? What if I could use the boat itself? Understanding dawned slowly. A floating hospital. Exactly. A floating hospital that could travel up and down the river, bringing medical care to towns and settlements that don't have their own doctors. A place that could move with the need, go where the suffering is. Clara's eyes were bright with the vision of it. The River Queen is perfect for it. She's big enough to hold treatment rooms, beds for patients, storage for medicines and supplies. And you've already done the hard work of making her sound again. Elias felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. And the diamonds? I'd want to sell them and use the money to outfit the boat medical equipment, medicines, hiring doctors and nurses. Whatever was left over would go to operating costs and paying the staff. Clara paused. But I'd need your help to make it happen. How so? The boat is yours, legally purchased. I can't take her from you, and I wouldn't want to even if I could. So here's what I'm proposing. I'll trade you the diamonds for the River Queen. You take the stones, sell them however you see fit, keep the money for yourself. I take the boat and turn her into the medical mission my father wanted me to create. Elias stared at her. You'd give me a fortune in diamonds just for this old boat? This old boat is worth more to me than the diamonds, Clara said simply. She was my father's pride. Turning her into something that helps people, something that fulfills the promise I made to him that's worth more than any amount of money. And what would you live on? If you give away all the diamonds to me, what do you do for yourself? I'd work on the boat. I have some medical training. I studied nursing for 2 years before my father's health declined, and I had to leave school to care for him. I could assist the doctors, help with patients, manage the day-to-day operations. Clara smiled slightly. I don't need much, Mr. Cole. A cabin aboard the Queen, food to eat, meaningful work to do, that would be enough. Elias walked to the railing and looked out at the river. The water was brown and lazy this time of year, moving slow toward its eventual meeting with the Mississippi. He thought about Dutch's words from this morning, about intent and context. He thought about his father's tintype and the pride in Thomas Cole's eyes as he stood on a steamboat deck. Let me make sure I understand, he said slowly. You're offering to give me diamonds worth what? Thousands? Tens of thousands? At least 50,000. Possibly more depending on the market and the quality of the stones. $50,000. Elias let the number settle. It was more money than he'd make in 10 lifetimes as a cowboy, more than he'd ever dreamed of having. And, in exchange, you get the River Queen and turn her into a floating hospital. Yes. Why not just buy the boat from me directly? Pay me a fair price and keep the diamonds for yourself. Because this way is cleaner, Clara said. No questions about where the diamonds came from, no legal complications about who owns what. You sell the stones as your property. I operate the hospital with funds I raise separately. We each walk away with what we need most. Elias turned to face her. What I need most is to know I did the right thing, that I didn't take advantage of someone, didn't profit from another person's loss. You wouldn't be, Clara said firmly. You'd be giving me the thing I need to fulfill a promise to my dying father. You'd be making it possible for this boat to become something that helps people instead of just sitting here as a pretty memorial. That's not taking advantage. That's giving me a gift. A gift you're paying $50,000 for. A trade, Clara corrected. We're both getting what we need. That's the definition of a fair trade. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I think about it? Just for a day or two?" "Of course. This is a life-changing decision. You should take whatever time you need." Clara picked up her satchel. "But Mr. Cole, Elias, I want you to know something. Whatever you decide, I'm grateful for what you've done here. You saved this boat. You gave her back her dignity. That matters to me more than you probably realize." After she left, Elias stood alone on the deck and tried to imagine the River Queen as a floating hospital. Tried to picture doctors working in the main cabin, patients recovering in beds where passengers had once slept, medicine and supplies stored where cargo had once been stacked. It was a good vision, noble even, the kind of thing his father would have approved of. But $50,000 was a lot of money to walk away from without being absolutely certain he was making the right choice. Word spread through Cottonwood Bend, the way it always did in small towns, quietly at first, then all at once. By the third day after Clara's proposal, Elias couldn't walk down Main Street without someone stopping him to ask about the woman from back east who'd been visiting the River Queen. Henry Watts cornered him at the general store. "Is it true she's some kind of railroad heiress?" "Her father was in railroads, among other things," Elias said carefully. "He's dead now." "And she wants to buy the boat?" "She's made an offer." "Well, don't sell her short," Henry said. "You put a lot of work into that vessel. Make sure you get a fair price." Elias nodded, but didn't elaborate. The truth was too complicated to explain, and he wasn't sure he understood it himself yet. That afternoon, he found Clara sitting on a bench near the dock, reading a newspaper. She looked up as he approached. "I was hoping I'd see you today. Mind if I sit? Please." Elias settled onto the bench beside her. Up close, he could see that the newspaper was dated from 2 weeks earlier, from a town called Council Bluffs. The headline read, "Cholera Outbreak Claims 12 Lives Town Desperate for Medical Aid." Clara noticed him looking. "There's another article in here about a settlement upriver where half the children have died from whooping cough because there's no doctor within 50 miles. She folded the paper carefully. These stories are everywhere. Small towns, river settlements, places where people are suffering because they don't have access to medical care. Every time I read one, I think about what the River Queen could do, how many lives she could touch." "It's a good dream," Elias said. "But you're not sure it's worth giving up $50,000. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I can see it in your face." Clara turned to look at him directly. "Elias, I meant what I said. This isn't charity on my part. You'd be giving me something I need, something I can't get any other way. The fact that what I need happens to be worth less money than what I'm offering in trade doesn't make the trade unfair. It just means we value different things. What would you do if I said no, if I decided to keep the boat and the diamonds both?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd be disappointed, but I'd respect your right to make that choice. The boat is yours, legally purchased. If you wanted to extract the diamonds and sell them yourself, you'd be within your rights. Would you fight me on it? Take me to court? No. What would be the point? My father hid those stones 20 years ago on a boat he no longer owned. I don't have any legal claim to them." She paused. "But I'd like to think you're the kind of man who does the right thing, even when the law doesn't require it." "And what's the right thing?" "I can't answer that for you. Only you know what sits right in your conscience." Elias looked out at the river. A barge was making its way downstream, loaded with timber. The men aboard waved as they passed, and Elias waved back automatically. "My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates," he said quietly. "It's measured by what he does with what he's been given. He lived by that, died by it too, worked himself into an early grave trying to build something good. Sounds like he and my father would have understood each other, Clara said. Different kinds of work, maybe, but the same basic belief that what you build matters more than what you hoard. Did your father die at peace? I think so. The panic broke him financially, but not spiritually. In his last days, he talked about the things he'd done wrong, the chances he'd missed to help people when he could have. That's when he asked me to promise him I'd do something good with whatever he left behind. Clara's voice was soft. He said he didn't want to die, knowing that all his work, all his accumulation of wealth, had come to nothing. So you're doing this for him. I'm doing it for both of us. For him, because I promised. For me, because I believe in it. She looked at Elias. What about you? What are you doing this for? It was a fair question, and one Elias had been asking himself since Clara first revealed the diamonds, he admitted. 6 months ago, I would have said I was doing it to honor my father's memory, to save something he'd cared about. But now it feels more complicated than that. Because of the money? Because of what the money represents. A second chance, a way to start over after losing everything in Montana. Security I haven't had in years, he paused. But also because of what giving up the money would represent. Choosing purpose over profit. Making something that matters more than making something that pays. Those aren't easy choices, Clara said. No, they're not. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river move past. Finally, Clara said, My father told me something else before he died. He said that most people spend their whole lives chasing after security, trying to build walls high enough and thick enough to keep out uncertainty. But the walls never hold. Sooner or later, life breaks through winter storms, financial panics, illness, death, all the things we can't control. Cheerful thought. Wait, there's more. He said that the only real security comes from knowing you spent your life doing something that mattered. Because when everything else falls apart, when the money's gone and the walls are broken, you can still look back and say, I built something good. I helped someone. I made a difference. Clara smiled slightly. He said that kind of security is the only kind that lasts. Elias thought about his ranch in Montana, about the years he'd spent building it up, only to watch it die in a single brutal winter. He thought about the River Queen, about the months of work that had brought her back from ruin. One had been taken from him by forces beyond his control. The other he'd saved through sheer determination and effort. I need to talk to someone, he said suddenly. There's a man in town, Dutch Kerner. He helped me with the restoration, taught me half of what I needed to know about boat construction. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I'd like to hear what he has to say about all this. That's wise, Clara said. Big decisions shouldn't be made in isolation. Will you be around tomorrow? I'll be at the boarding house. Mrs. Palmer's been kind enough to give me a room at a reduced rate. Clara stood up. Take whatever time you need, Elias. This isn't a decision to rush. That evening, Elias found Dutch Kerner at home, sitting on his front porch with a pipe and a cup of coffee. Dutch's wife, Margaret, brought out another cup for Elias and left them alone to talk. Elias told him everything. The diamonds, Clara's proposal, the plan for a floating hospital. He laid it all out, holding nothing back, and then sat back and waited for Dutch's reaction. Dutch was quiet for a long time, smoking his pipe and looking out at the darkening sky. Finally, he said, That's quite a story. What would you do? I can't answer that. It's your decision to make. I know, but I'm asking anyway. What would you do if you were in my place? Dutch knocked the ash from his pipe. I'd think about what I wanted my life to mean. Money's useful, no question. $50,000 would set you up for the rest of your days. But a floating hospital, that's something that would outlive you. That's something people would remember long after you're gone. Is that enough? Legacy? For some men it is, for others it's not. It was the question that mattered. The one Elias had been circling around for days without quite facing directly. He still didn't have an answer. The next morning, Elias was going through his belongings when he came across the bank notice. It was folded at the bottom of his wooden box, beneath his father's tintype and a few other keepsakes he'd carried south from Montana. He'd kept it not because he wanted to remember, but because throwing it away felt like pretending the loss hadn't happened. The notice was dated February 18th, 1896. Final warning of foreclosure. It read in crisp, impersonal typeface. Outstanding debt, $2,847. Property to be sold at auction March 15th, unless full payment received. He'd read it 100 times in the weeks after receiving it, each time hoping the words might somehow change. They never did. The bank wanted their money, and Elias didn't have it. Simple as that. 20 years of work, gone because of one brutal winter, and debts that had seemed manageable until they suddenly weren't. He'd walked away from that ranch with less than $1,000 and no clear idea of what came next. The only thing that had kept him moving forward was the vague memory of his father's logbook, the River Queen mentioned in those water-stained pages. Finding her, buying her, restoring her, it had given him purpose when he needed it most. Now Clara was offering him enough money to buy 10 ranches, enough to start over properly, with capital and resources and room for error, enough to never worry about foreclosure notices again. But taking that money meant giving up the River Queen, meant letting go of the thing that had pulled him back from the edge after Montana, meant choosing security over meaning. He folded the notice and put it back in the box, then headed into town. He found Clara at the boarding house, sitting in Mrs. Palmer's parlor with a stack of papers spread across the table in front of her. When she saw him, she gathered up the papers quickly. "Good morning," she said. "Morning. What are you working on?" "Morning." Clara hesitated, then spread the papers back out. "Plans for the River Queen, if the trade goes through. Treatment room layouts, supply inventories, cost estimates for medical equipment." She smiled ruefully. "I'm getting ahead of myself. I know you haven't decided yet, but I can't help thinking about what it could be." Elias looked at the papers. Clara had drawn careful diagrams of the River Queen's interior, marking out spaces for examination rooms, a surgery, beds for patients who needed overnight care. She'd made lists of medicines and supplies, names of doctors who might be willing to work on a floating hospital, potential routes up and down the river that would maximize the number of people they could help. "You've put a lot of thought into this," he said. "I've had 3 years to think about it, ever since my father told me about the diamonds and what he wanted me to do with them." She picked up one of the diagrams. "I know this might seem presumptuous, planning it all out before you've even agreed. But I needed to know if it was actually possible, if the River Queen could really work as a hospital, or if I was just chasing a dream that couldn't happen. And can it work? I think so. The boat is big enough, sturdy enough. You've already done the structural work that would have cost the most money. With the right equipment and staff, she could serve hundreds of people every month. Maybe thousands over the course of a year." Clara looked at him. "Have you reached a decision?" "Not yet, but I'm getting closer." Elias pulled out a chair and sat down. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why does it have to be the River Queen specifically? With $50,000 you could build a hospital anywhere. Buy a building, hire staff, establish a proper medical center in a city where you'd have access to more patients, better resources." "I could," Clara agreed, "but that's not what my father asked me to do. He specifically told me about the diamonds hidden in the River Queen. He could have told me about money in a bank, or property I could sell, or any number of other things. But he told me about the boat, about the treasure hidden in the wheel. I think that was intentional." "Why?" "Because the River Queen represented something to him. Pride, yes, but also possibility. The idea that something old and forgotten could be brought back to life, could be given new purpose." Clara's eyes were distant, remembering. "He told me, right before he died, that he'd failed in a lot of ways, made bad investments, trusted the wrong people, let his pride get in the way of good judgment. But he said the River Queen was one thing he'd done right. One thing he'd built that was solid and true and good. And then he had to sell her. And then he had to sell her. Clara repeated. It broke his heart. But now, if I can bring her back not as a freight boat or a passenger vessel, but as something that helps people, it would redeem that loss somehow. It would prove that his pride in her was justified. Elias understood that feeling, understood the need to prove that something lost hadn't been wasted. He thought about his ranch, about the years of work that had ended in foreclosure. What would it mean to take that loss and transform it into something purposeful, to prove that even failure could lead to something worth having? What if we could do both? He said suddenly. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? What if you got the River Queen for your hospital and I kept enough of the diamonds to start over? Elias leaned forward. Split them down the middle. You use half to outfit the boat and fund the medical mission. I use half to buy land, maybe start a small ranch, something manageable. That's generous, Clara said slowly. But it's not what I proposed. I know, but your proposal puts all the burden on me. I either take everything and walk away, or I give everything and stay with nothing. This way, we both get what we need. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she shook her head. I appreciate the offer, Elias. I do. But I can't build a sustainable hospital on half the money. The equipment alone costs thousands of dollars. Then there's salaries for doctors and nurses, medicines, supplies, operating expenses. I need the full amount to make this work properly. Then take 3/4. Leave me 1/4 of the diamonds. Elias, please, just hear me out. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. I've lost everything once already. Had it taken from me by weather and debt and circumstances I couldn't control. I can't go through that again, Clara. I can't bet everything I have on a dream and watch it slip away. A floating hospital isn't the same as a cattle ranch in Montana. I know, but the feeling is the same. The fear that I'll pour everything into it and end up with nothing. He turned to face her. 1/4 of the diamonds would give me enough to start small. Buy a piece of land, build something modest, have security while still helping you do something good. That's not unreasonable, is it? Clara looked at him for a long time. Finally, she said, No, it's not unreasonable. It's practical and sensible, and exactly what most people would want. She paused. But it's not what I'm offering. I need all the diamonds to make this work, Elias. I can't do it halfway. Then you're asking me to choose between security and purpose. I suppose I am. That's not a fair choice. I never said it was fair, Clara said quietly. I just said it was the choice you have to make. Elias walked to the table and looked down at her diagrams, her careful plans for turning the River Queen into something that mattered. He thought about the ranch he'd lost, about the foreclosure notice in his wooden box. He thought about his father's tintype, about the pride in Thomas Cole's eyes as he stood on a steamboat deck. I need more time, he said. How much time? I don't know. A few more days, maybe. Clara nodded. Take whatever you need. But Elias, understand that every day we delay is another day that people are suffering without medical care. Another day that the River Queen sits empty when she could be saving lives. I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a man who's afraid to let go of something he's already lost. The words hit harder than Elias expected. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't fear holding him back, but simple common sense. But when he opened his mouth, no words came out. Because maybe Clara was right. Maybe he was holding on to the idea of security the same way he'd held on to that foreclosure notice, not because it served any purpose, but because letting go felt like admitting defeat. 2 days later, Elias was working on the River Queen's aft deck when he heard raised voices coming from the dock. He looked up to see Clara walking quickly toward the boat, and behind her a man in a fine suit was following, his voice carrying across the water. Clara, please. We need to discuss this reasonably. There's nothing to discuss, Richard. I told you in my letter that I wasn't coming back to Philadelphia. Your letter said you were pursuing a business opportunity. It didn't mention that you'd be squandering your last resources on some ridiculous medical fantasy. Clara reached the gangplank and started across, But the man, Richard, followed her right onto the boat. Elias set down his tools and moved to intercept. "Miss Vanderbilt, is this man bothering you?" Clara turned, and Elias could see the frustration in her face. "Elias, this is Richard Pemberton. He's a lawyer who worked with my father. Richard, this is Elias Cole. He owns the River Queen." Richard barely glanced at Elias before turning back to Clara. "I've come a long way to speak with you. The least you can do is hear me out." "Fine," Clara said tightly, "but not here. We can talk at the boarding house." "No, I want to see this boat that you're so determined to waste your inheritance on." Clara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Very well." She looked at Elias. "I apologize for this intrusion." "No need to apologize," Elias said. But something in the exchange had put him on edge. He followed them to the pilot house area, staying close enough to intervene if needed. Richard walked around the deck, his expression making clear what he thought of the River Queen. "This is what you've been searching for? This wreck? This restored vessel?" Clara corrected. "And yes, this is exactly what I've been looking for." "Clara, be reasonable. Even if you somehow manage to convert this boat into a hospital, even if you find doctors willing to work on it, you'll be dead within a year." The words landed like a physical blow. Elias saw Clara flinch, saw her hand go to her side in an involuntary gesture that she quickly suppressed. "That's not certain," she said quietly. "It's certain enough. Dr. Morrison was very clear about your prognosis. Without proper treatment, without rest and care, the consumption will kill you, probably before next winter." Richard's voice softened slightly. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm trying to help you. Come back to Philadelphia. Use whatever money you can find to get the best medical care available. Don't throw your life away on this project." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. Consumption. Clara was dying. "I've already received the best medical care available," Clara said. "Dr. Morrison told me I have perhaps 14 months, possibly less. No amount of treatment will change that. The disease is too advanced." "Then why are you doing this? Why chase after hidden diamonds and old boats when you should be spending your remaining time in comfort?" "Because comfort isn't what I need, Richard. Purpose is what I need. Legacy is what I need." Clara's voice was steady now. Resolved. "I made a promise to my father. I intend to keep it, regardless of how much time I have left. By bankrupting yourself and dying alone on a river somewhere, by creating something that will outlive me, something that will help people long after I'm gone." Clara turned to look at the River Queen, at her rebuilt decks and polished fittings. "This boat will still be here when I'm not. The hospital will still be operating, still serving people who have nowhere else to turn. That's worth more than a few extra months in a comfortable bed." Richard shook his head. "I can't support this, Clara, and if you won't listen to reason, I'll have to take other measures to protect you from yourself." "What measures?" "Your father's will included a provision allowing his executor, that would be me, to intervene if you showed signs of diminished capacity or poor judgment regarding your inheritance. I could make a case that this entire scheme falls under that provision." "You wouldn't dare." "I would, if it meant saving your life." Richard pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I have injunction papers ready to file. If you proceed with this boat purchase, I'll file them and freeze whatever assets you have left. You'll spend your remaining months fighting me in court instead of building your hospital." Clara's face went pale. "You have no right." "I have every right. Your father trusted me to look after your interests. My father wanted me to build this hospital. You know that. He told you about the diamonds, about what he wanted me to do with them. He told me he hoped you'd do something meaningful. He didn't tell me to stand by and watch you kill yourself in the process." Richard moved toward the gangplank. "You have until tomorrow to make a decision, Clara. Come back to Philadelphia and seek proper treatment, or I file the injunction. Your choice." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps heavy on the wooden planks as he crossed the dock and disappeared toward town. Clara stood frozen for a moment, then her knees seemed to give out. Elias caught her before she could fall, guiding her to sit on one of the deck crates. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "You shouldn't have had to hear that." "How long have you known?" Elias asked. "About the consumption? Almost a year. I started having symptoms just after my father died, but I didn't want to believe it was serious. By the time I saw Dr. Morrison, it was too late for any real treatment." She looked up at him. "I should have told you. Before I made the proposal, before any of this. But I was afraid you wouldn't take me seriously if you knew." "Why wouldn't I take you seriously?" "Because I'm dying, Elias. People hear that and they assume you can't think straight, can't make rational decisions. They start treating you like you're already gone, like nothing you say or do matters anymore." Elias sat down beside her. "Is that why you're in such a hurry? Why you need all the diamonds instead of splitting them?" "Partly, but also because it's true. I need the full amount to make the hospital work. I won't be around to raise additional funds or make up shortfalls. Whatever I set up now has to be sustainable on its own, has to be able to keep running after I'm gone." She wiped at her eyes. "I know what Richard said sounded harsh, but he's not entirely wrong. I probably will die somewhere on this river, working myself into an early grave. But at least it will be while doing something that matters. What about treatment? What about trying to fight the disease? I've tried. There is no fighting it, not really. I can rest and take medicines and slow it down a little, but the end result is the same. I'm going to die, probably within the next year. The only choice I have is how I spend whatever time I have left." Elias thought about the foreclosure notice, about loss and letting go. He thought about Clara's careful diagrams, her plans for treatment rooms and patient beds. He thought about his father's pride in the River Queen, and William Vanderbilt's dying wish that his daughter do something good with what he left behind. "What will you do?" he asked. "About Richard's threat? I don't know. If he files that injunction, I'll be tied up in legal proceedings for months. By the time it's resolved, I'll be too sick to do anything useful. The hospital will never get built." Clara's voice was bitter. "He thinks he's protecting me, but he's actually destroying the one thing I have left to give. Can you fight the injunction? Maybe. But it would cost money I don't have, and time I definitely don't have." They sat in silence for a while, the river moving past, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Finally, Elias said, "What if there was a way to make this work? To get you the boat and the diamonds without Richard being able to stop it?" Clara looked at him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if we do this fast enough, if we complete the trade before Richard can file his papers, there won't be anything for him to freeze. The boat will be yours, legally transferred. The diamonds will be mine, legally sold. He can file whatever he wants, but he can't undo transactions that are already complete. That would require doing everything today, right now." "Then we do it now." Elias stood up. "We go to the town council, file the transfer of ownership, we extract the diamonds from the wheel, and I take possession. All of it above board, all of it documented, so Richard can't claim anything improper happened." "Elias, are you sure? You still haven't decided what you want to do?" He looked at the River Queen, at 6 months of his labor made visible in her rebuilt decks and sturdy hull. He thought about security and purpose, about fear and faith. "I'm sure," he said. "Let's build you a hospital." They moved fast. Clara went to find Henry Watts, while Elias gathered the tools they'd need to open the remaining wheel spokes. By the time she returned with Henry, Dutch Kerner, and 2 other town council members, Elias had the pilot house area lit with 3 lanterns and had already figured out the mechanism for releasing the first spoke. "Gentlemen," Clara said as they climbed aboard, "thank you for coming on such short notice. Mr. Cole and I are prepared to complete a transfer of ownership for the River Queen, and we'd like witnesses present to ensure everything is done properly." Henry Watts looked between them, clearly sensing the urgency. "What's the rush? This morning you were still thinking it over, Elias." "Circumstances changed," Elias said. "There's a lawyer in town who's threatening legal action that could tie this whole thing up in court for months. We need to complete the transfer today, before he has a chance to file any papers." What kind of legal action? Asked Tom Brennan, the eldest council member. The kind that doesn't concern you, Clara said firmly. This is a private matter, but I can assure you that Mr. Cole and I are both of sound mind and acting of our own free will. We're simply expediting a transaction we were going to complete anyway. Dutch Kerner examined the ship's wheel, then looked at Elias. Is this what I think it is? Probably. Lord Almighty. What's in the wheel? Tom asked. Elias and Clara exchanged a look. Finally, Clara said, Hidden valuables placed there by my father 20 years ago. That's what I'm trading for the boat, the valuables in exchange for ownership. And you need us to witness this? We need you to witness the transfer of ownership and to verify that both parties are acting voluntarily. What we're trading is our business. Henry scratched his jaw. All right, let's see what we're dealing with here. Elias showed them the mechanism Clara had discovered, the catch hidden beneath the brass mounting plate. Then, methodically, he began opening the wheel spokes one by one. The first spoke yielded a leather pouch identical to the one Clara had shown him days earlier. Elias loosened the drawstring and poured a handful of rough diamonds into his palm. Even uncut, even in the lantern light, they caught and held the eye. Sweet mercy, Tom Brennan breathed. The second spoke held another pouch, and the third, and the fourth. Each time Elias opened one, he felt the weight of what he was doing settle heavier on his shoulders. This wasn't just money, it was security, opportunity, a second chance at everything he'd lost. And he was trading it all for the satisfaction of doing the right thing. The fifth spoke was stuck. Elias had to use a pry bar to work it loose, and when it finally came free, the pouch inside had split, spilling diamonds across the pilot house deck. They scattered like drops of frozen rain, and everyone scrambled to collect them. How many more? Henry asked, clearly overwhelmed. 3, Clara said. She was keeping a careful inventory, writing down the contents of each pouch in a small notebook. The 6th and 7th spokes opened without incident. The 8th and final spoke was the largest, mounted at the top of the wheel where it supported the most weight. When Elias pulled it free, he found not one pouch but 2, both larger than the others. In total, there were 10 leather pouches of varying sizes. Clara counted the stones as carefully as she could in the lamplight, her hands shaking slightly. When she finished, she looked up at the assembled men. Gentlemen, there are approximately 412 uncut diamonds here, ranging in size from half a carat to what appears to be nearly 5 carats. I cannot provide an exact valuation without a professional assessment, but based on what my father told me and current market conditions, I estimate the total value at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. Tom Brennan sat down heavily on a crate. And you're trading all of this for the River Queen? Yes. Miss Vanderbilt, I mean no disrespect, but that seems like a poor trade on your part. This boat's not worth 1/10 of that. The boat is worth exactly that to me, Clara said firmly. And this trade is exactly what I want to make. Dutch Kerner had been quiet through the entire process, just watching with his arms crossed. Now he said, Elias, can I have a word with you? Private? They moved to the far end of the deck, out of earshot of the others. Dutch looked at him seriously. You're really doing this? Giving up a fortune for a boat you're going to hand over to someone you barely know? I know her well enough. Do you know she's dying? Elias felt a chill. I saw her at the general store yesterday, buying medicine. The same kind my brother took when he had consumption, before it killed him. Dutch's voice was gentle. I'm not saying she's lying to you or trying to cheat you, but you should understand what you're getting into. That hospital she wants to build, she might not live to see it operational. I know. She told me today. And you're still going through with this? I'm still going through with it. Elias looked back at the pilot house, where Clara was carefully gathering the diamonds into a wooden box they'd brought for the purpose. She's trying to build something that outlives her. Dutch. Something that helps people. I can't think of a better use for that money. Even if it means you walk away with nothing? I'm not walking away with nothing. I'm walking away knowing I helped make something good happen. My father would have understood that. I think you do too." Dutch was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're a better man than most, Elias Cole." He clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, let's make this official." They returned to the pilot house. Henry Watts had brought the official town ledger and was preparing to record the transaction. "Before we proceed, I need both parties to state clearly that they're entering into this agreement voluntarily and with full understanding of the terms." "I am," Clara said. "I am," Elias echoed. "And the terms are, Elias Cole transfers full ownership of the steamboat River Queen, all associated equipment and property, to Clara Vanderbilt. In exchange, Clara Vanderbilt transfers ownership of the valuables recovered from the ship's wheel to Elias Cole. Is that correct?" "That's correct," they said in unison. Henry wrote it all down in his careful script, then had both Elias and Clara sign. The other council members signed as witnesses. When it was done, Henry tore out the page and made a copy, giving one to each party. "It's official," he said. "The River Queen now belongs to Miss Vanderbilt." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she took her copy. "Thank you, all of you." "What will you do with the boat?" Tom asked. "Convert her into a floating hospital. Bring medical care to river communities that don't have doctors." Clara looked around at the restored vessel. "This boat has a second chance at life. I'm going to make sure she uses it well." "That's a fine thing," Tom said quietly. "A fine thing indeed." The council members left shortly after, though Dutch stayed behind to help secure the diamonds in a strongbox Elias had borrowed from the bank. As they were working, Elias heard footsteps on the gangplank. Richard Pemberton strode onto the deck, his face flushed with anger. "Clara, what have you done?" "I've completed the transaction," Clara said calmly. "The River Queen is now mine. The valuables are now Elias's. It's all legal and properly documented. I specifically told you not to proceed with this insanity, and I specifically chose not to listen." Clara held up her copy of the transfer document. "There's nothing you can do about it now, Richard. The deed is done. I can still file the injunction. I can have the transaction reversed." "On what grounds?" Elias cut in. "We had proper witnesses, fair exchange of value, both parties acting voluntarily. There's nothing improper about what we did. She's not in her right mind. The consumption affects her lungs, not her judgment," Dutch said. He'd been standing quietly by the strongbox, but now he stepped forward. "I've seen consumption up close, Mr. Pemberton. I watched my brother die from it. Miss Vanderbilt is clear-headed, purposeful, and fully capable of making her own decisions." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Dutch's expression stopped him. Instead, he turned to Clara. "You're making a terrible mistake. You could have had months of good care, comfortable living. Instead, you'll die exhausted on a river somewhere, having wasted everything your father left you." "My father left me more than just money," Clara said. "He left me a purpose, a reason to keep going even when everything seems impossible." She walked to the ship's wheel and rested her hand on the brass fittings. "This boat was his pride. Now it'll be his legacy, and mine." "I wash my hands of this," Richard said. "When it all falls apart, don't come begging for my help." "I won't need to. I have everything I need right here." Richard left, his footsteps angry on the gangplank. When he was gone, Clara's composure finally cracked. She sat down on a crate, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Are you all right?" Elias asked. "Just tired. It's been a long day." She managed a small smile. "But a good one, a very good one." Dutch helped Elias move the strongbox to the bank's vault for safekeeping, then went home to his wife. Elias walked Clara back to the boarding house as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Thank you," Clara said at the door, "for believing in this, for believing in me." "Thank you for giving me a reason to believe in something again," Elias replied. That night, alone in the captain's quarters for what would be one of the last times, Elias looked at the ship's wheel, now empty of its hidden treasure, but somehow seeming more valuable than ever. Tomorrow, The real work would begin. Tomorrow, they'd start transforming the River Queen into a floating hospital. But tonight, Elias felt something he hadn't felt since before the Montana winter. Hope. Simple, honest hope that the future might hold something worth working toward. 3 weeks later, the first crates of medical supplies arrived on the afternoon steamboat from St. Louis. Elias watched from the dock as they were unloaded 12 large wooden boxes stamped with the names of pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment manufacturers. Each one represented a piece of Clara's vision becoming real. He'd sold the diamonds in St. Louis himself, making the trip upriver with Dutch Kerner as a companion and guard. The jeweler who'd assessed them had confirmed Clara's estimate $68,000 for the lot. Though Elias negotiated up to 72, it was more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. He'd kept 12,000 for himself, enough to buy a small piece of land, build a modest house, live comfortably without having to worry about foreclosure notices ever again. The rest, $60,000, he'd placed in a trust account for the River Queen Hospital Foundation, with Clara as the primary administrator and a board of trustees to ensure the money was spent wisely. She'd cried when he told her what he'd done, not the full amount she'd hoped for, but more than enough to make the hospital work and keep it running for years. Now those plans were becoming reality. Clara stood on the River Queen's deck, directing a crew of workers as they carried the crates aboard. She moved with careful precision, each step measured, conserving her energy. Elias could see the disease taking its toll. She was thinner than she'd been 3 weeks ago, and sometimes she had to stop and catch her breath, but her eyes burned with purpose. "The examination room supplies go in the forward cabin," she called out. "Surgical equipment in the aft cabin. Everything else can be stored in the main hold for now." Dutch Kerner had volunteered his time to help with the conversion, and he'd brought along his 2 grown sons. Together, they were rebuilding the interior walls, creating separate rooms for treatment, recovery, and storage. Ben Corrigan from the sawmill had donated lumber at cost, and Henry Watts had extended indefinite credit for supplies. Word had spread through Cottonwood Bend and beyond about what Clara was doing. Some folks thought it was foolish, a waste of good money, but others saw it differently. They saw hope in a form they'd never expected, medical care that could come to them instead of requiring them to travel days to reach the nearest doctor. Elias helped carry the crates aboard, his muscles remembering the work of restoration, even though it had been weeks since he'd done this kind of labor regularly. As he set down a particularly heavy box marked surgical instruments, Clara approached him. "You didn't have to give me 60,000, she said quietly. 12,000 would have been a fair split. 12,000 is more than I need. 60,000 is what the hospital needs." Elias straightened up. "Besides, this way, I'm still connected to what happens here. I helped build it, in my own way. You did more than help build it. You made it possible." Clara rested her hand on one of the crates. "When I was searching for the River Queen, when I spent 3 years following every lead and chasing every rumor, there were times I thought I'd never find her, that she'd been scrapped or sunk or burned, and my father's legacy would be lost forever. But you saved her. You kept her intact long enough for me to find her. I'm glad it worked out." "So am I," Clara smiled, then turned as one of the workers called for her attention. "Excuse me, apparently there's a question about the recovery room layout." Elias watched her go, noticing the slight hitch in her step, the way she had to steady herself against the railing. The consumption was advancing faster than anyone had hoped. Dr. Morrison had come from St. Louis last week and examined her thoroughly. He'd told Elias privately that Clara might not make it to next spring, but she was spending every day she had left, making the River Queen into something extraordinary. The main cabin was already transformed, examination tables set up, cabinets being built for medicine storage, a surgical suite taking shape in what had once been the captain's private quarters. She'd hired 2 doctors, both young men eager to do good work, even if the pay wasn't substantial. 3 nurses had signed on as well, women with experience working in frontier conditions. By Clara's estimates, the River Queen Hospital would be ready to receive its first patients within 6 weeks. 6 weeks to turn a restored steamboat into a functioning medical facility. 6 weeks to make the impossible real. That evening, as the workers finished for the day and headed back to town, Elias helped Clara hang the sign. It was a simple wooden board, painted white with black lettering, River Queen Hospital Medical Care for all who need it. They mounted it on the forward deck, visible from the shore. As they stepped back to admire their work, Clara said, "My father would have loved this, seeing the River Queen serving people, making a difference." "I think he'd be proud of you," Elias said. "I hope so." Clara touched the sign gently. "I hope when I'm gone, people will remember why this mattered, why it was worth everything." "They will," Elias promised. "I'll make sure of it." The River Queen Hospital opened on a grey October morning, 6 weeks to the day after the medical supplies had arrived. Clara insisted on being present, despite Dr. Morrison's protests that she should be resting. She stood on the deck in a simple dress, her hair pulled back, looking fragile but determined as the first patients began to arrive. They came from all over: farmers with infected wounds, children with fevers, a woman heavy with child who'd been bleeding and needed help. Some walked, some rode in wagons, some were carried by family members who'd heard there was finally a doctor within reach. Dr. James Whitmore, one of the young physicians Clara had hired, examined them one by one. His colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, handled the more urgent cases in the surgical suite. The nurses moved efficiently between patients, taking notes in a leather-bound registry that would serve as the hospital's official record. Elias watched from the dock as the River Queen transformed from a restored vessel into a living, working hospital. He'd helped where he could during the conversion, carrying supplies, holding boards while Dutch measured and cut, running errands into town. But this moment, this actual realization of Clara's vision, belonged to her and the medical staff she'd assembled. The first entry in the patient registry was for a boy named Thomas Wheeler, age 7, suffering from a severe fever. Dr. Whitmore diagnosed it as scarlet fever and began immediate treatment. The second entry was for Mary Corrigan, Ben's sister, who'd been dealing with an infected leg wound for 3 weeks. Dr. Chen cleaned and dressed it properly, then showed Mary's mother how to care for it at home. By midday, they'd treated 11 patients. By evening, the count was up to 23. Clara sat on a chair on the deck, exhausted but radiant. When Elias brought her water, she smiled at him. "It's working. It's actually working. Did you doubt it would?" "Every day," she admitted. "Every single day, I worried something would go wrong, that I'd run out of time before we could open, that no one would come even if we did open. But they're coming. They're trusting us with their health, with their children. That's everything." Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway of the main cabin. "Clara, you need to rest. You've been on your feet for 8 hours. There are still patients waiting. And there are 3 doctors and 3 nurses to handle them. You've done your part. Let us do ours." He helped her to her feet, gentle but firm. "Come on. There's a bed in the recovery room with your name on it." Clara looked at Elias. "Will you stay? Make sure everything." "I'll stay," Elias promised. "Go rest." As Dr. Morrison guided Clara inside, Elias took her place on the deck. He greeted new arrivals, directed them to the registration desk, helped an elderly man up the gangplank when his legs proved unsteady. Around sunset, a family arrived in a wagon, a father, mother, and daughter, maybe 12 years old. The girl was unconscious, burning with fever. The father carried her aboard in his arms, his face etched with desperation. "Please," he said. "She's been sick for days. The fever won't break. I don't know what else to do." Dr. Chen took one look at the girl and called for assistance. They carried her into the examination room, and Elias heard the rapid-fire medical conversation through the open-door: symptoms, possible diagnoses, treatment options. The father stood on the deck, holding his wife as she wept. Elias approached them carefully. The doctors here are good. They'll do everything they can. Are they really free? The father asked. We don't have money. We already lost our crop to drought, and I don't know how we'd pay. Free, Elias confirmed. That's the whole point. Medical care for everyone who needs it, whether they can pay or not. The man's face crumpled. God bless whoever made this possible. Her name is Clara Vanderbilt, Elias said, and you can tell her yourself when your daughter's better. 2 hours later, Dr. Chen emerged with good news. The girl was stable, the fever was breaking, and she'd likely make a full recovery with a few days of rest and careful monitoring. The family could stay aboard if they wanted, in the recovery room. The father shook Dr. Chen's hand, then Elias's, then went to sit with his daughter. Elias watched him through the cabin window, a man who'd arrived desperate and was leaving with hope. That night, Elias found Clara in the recovery room, sitting beside the sleeping girl. She looked up as he entered. I saw them arrive, she said quietly. The Hendersons. Tom told me about their daughter. Dr. Chen saved her life. The River Queen saved her life. This boat, this hospital, it's doing exactly what it was meant to do. Clara's voice was thick with emotion. My father would have been so proud. He would have been proud of you, Elias said, for making it happen. We made it happen. You and me and Dutch and Henry and everyone who helped. This isn't just my legacy, Elias. It's ours. Outside, the river moved past, dark and eternal. Inside the River Queen Hospital, 19 patients slept in beds, recovering from illness and injury, cared for by doctors and nurses who dedicated themselves to serving those in need. The gamble had paid off. The dream had become real. Spring came early to the Missouri River country in 1897. By April, the ice had broken and the water ran high and fast, carrying snowmelt from the mountains down toward the distant sea. Standing on the dock at Cottonwood Bend, Elias watched the River Queen prepare for her first journey upriver as a fully operational hospital. Clara had died in February, 3 days after her 41st birthday. The consumption had taken her quietly in her sleep aboard the boat she'd worked so hard to create. Dr. Morrison said she'd lasted longer than anyone expected, that sheer determination had kept her going months past when the disease should have claimed her. They'd buried her in the town cemetery, beneath a simple stone that read, Clara Vanderbilt, 1856 to 1897. She built hope. But her real memorial was the River Queen herself. In the 5 months since opening, the hospital had treated over 600 patients. The doctors and nurses Clara had hired continued their work, funded by the trust Elias had established. The boat moved up and down the river now, stopping at settlements and towns that had never seen a doctor, bringing medical care to people who'd long gone without. Today, they were embarking on their longest journey yet, a month-long trip upriver to Fort Benton and back, stopping at every settlement along the way. Elias had asked to come along, and Dr. Whitmore had agreed. We could use an extra set of hands, the young doctor had said, and someone who knows how to talk to cowboys and farmers. You have a way of making people comfortable. Elias carried his bedroll aboard and stowed it in the small cabin that had once been the captain's quarters, the same room where he'd slept during the months of restoration. It felt strange to be back, like revisiting a life he'd lived in some other age. On the wall beside the door, someone had mounted a brass plaque. Elias paused to read the words he'd helped compose. In memory of William Vanderbilt, who built this vessel with pride, and Clara Vanderbilt, who gave her life to make it serve those in need. May the River Queen Hospital continue their legacy of compassion and care. Below the plaque, in a glass-fronted case, sat his father's logbook, the water-stained journal, with its careful notations about the river and the boats that had travelled it. Elias had donated it to the hospital, thinking it belonged here, part of the River Queen's history. Dr. Chen had added new entries in a different hand, documenting the hospital's journeys and the patients they'd served. The latest entry read, the 12th of April 1897, departed Cottonwood Bend for Fort Benton. Crew, Dr. James Whitmore, Dr. Sarah Chen, Nurse Elizabeth Hart, Nurse Mary Sullivan, Nurse Grace Thompson, and Volunteer Elias Cole. Weather clear, river high. May this journey bring healing to all who need it. Are you ready? Dr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway. As ready as I'll ever be. They cast off an hour before noon, the River Queen's paddle wheel churning water as she moved away from the dock. A crowd had gathered to see them off. Henry Watts, Dutch Kerner, and his family, Ben Corrigan, Mrs. Palmer, from the boarding house. They waved and cheered as the hospital boat made her way upriver. Elias stood on the deck and thought about the first time he'd seen the River Queen, half buried in mud, abandoned and forgotten. He thought about the months of work, the splinters and aching muscles, the slow transformation from wreck to vessel. He thought about Clara showing him the first diamond, about the choice he'd faced, about the decision to trade security for purpose. With the $12,000 he'd kept, Elias had bought a small piece of land just outside Cottonwood Bend. Nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a creek running through it, enough for a modest house and maybe a few head of cattle. He'd built the house himself over the winter, working steadily but without the desperate urgency that had driven him during the ranch years in Montana. He had a place to return to now, a home of his own, but more than that, the River Queen Hospital had given him something he hadn't known. He needed a reason to believe that loss could be transformed into something meaningful, that failure wasn't the end of the story. As the boat moved upriver, passing familiar landmarks his father had documented in the logbook, Elias felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Not the peace of having everything figured out, but the peace of knowing he was doing something that mattered. That evening, they stopped at a small settlement called Willow Creek. Word had spread ahead of them somehow, and people were waiting on the bank when they arrived. An elderly woman with a cough that wouldn't clear, a young man with a broken arm set poorly, a pregnant woman worried about her baby. Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitmore worked late into the night, treating everyone who came. Elias helped where he could, holding lanterns, fetching supplies, talking to worried family members while the doctors worked. The same things he'd done during the hospital's first days of operation, the same simple acts of service that felt more valuable than any amount of money in a bank. Near midnight, when the last patient had been treated and the boat was quiet, Elias stood on the deck and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars that had shone over his ranch in Montana, the same ones that had watched him struggle and fail and eventually start over. But somehow they seemed brighter now, more welcoming. He thought about Clara's words, about how her father had said the only real security came from knowing you'd spent your life doing something that mattered. He understood now what that meant. The ranch in Montana was gone, lost to weather and circumstance. But the River Queen was here, floating strong, saving lives, building a legacy that would outlast anyone who'd touched her. Sometimes the biggest gambles in life aren't made at card tables. Sometimes they're made with your last dollars and a dream nobody else believes in. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those gambles pay off in ways you never expected. The river moved beneath the boat, eternal and unchanging. The River Queen Hospital moved with it, carrying hope upstream.